My name is Vivienne Ashworth. I am 34 years old, and on the 24th of December, 2 years ago, I sat alone in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating takeout pad thai straight from the container, watching the snow fall in slow arcs against my window, while 12 miles across town my family was gathered around a fireplace I had helped pay for, telling stories and opening wine, celebrating a holiday that I had apparently been voted out of. They had not asked me to step back from Christmas the way someone might ask a guest to lower their voice. They had called me on the phone 8 days prior and told me plainly that my presence created an energy my sister could not manage, that I should celebrate separately, that I would understand because I was the strong one and strong ones always understand. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I said, "Okay, Mom, I understand." And then I set my phone face down on my kitchen counter and I sat very still for a very long time. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks before that phone call, I had quietly begun the paperwork to restructure the $3 million family trust I had been managing alone for 6 years. Not to dissolve it, not to drain it, to rebuild its architecture so that no one could ever again make a significant decision about that money without my explicit consent. What they didn't know was that I had been the invisible engine of that trust since my grandmother died in 2016. That every quarterly distribution, every portfolio rebalance, every amended tax filing had passed through my hands, my signature, my desk on Saturday mornings while my family forgot I existed between holidays. What they didn't know was that on December 16th, when my mother told me I was too inconvenient for Christmas, the last load-bearing beam in the structure of my compliance finally gave way. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I got very, very quiet. This is that story. To understand what happened at Easter brunch this past March, in a dining room in Bexley with 23 people and 2 attorneys present, you need to understand the Ashworth family the way I understood it, not the version they performed at neighborhood gatherings. The version I had been watching from the margins for 34 years. My father, Carlton Ashworth, is 62 years old. He is a man who has always had a gift for looking successful. He drove the right cars, belonged to the right club, wore a watch that announced itself before he did. What he's been less consistent at is actually building wealth in any lasting way. He spent the better part of 3 decades as a mid-level commercial real estate broker in Columbus. His income was market-dependent and volatile. Boom years were good. Slow cycles were bad. He learned to bridge the gap by living adjacent to the perception of prosperity rather than inside its reality. He managed this performance convincingly for a long time, and the reason he managed it convincingly was my mother. Loretta Ashworth, née Callahan, is 60 years old. She is a woman of warmth and certainty, certain above all things that she was born to be comfortable. She has not held a job for longer than 11 months at any point in her adult life. She does not apologize for this. Her father, my grandfather Warren Callahan, built a small but profitable chain of industrial supply warehouses across central Ohio through the 1970s and 1980s. He was a quiet, practical man who worked early mornings and late evenings and did not spend what he had not earned. When he died in 2004, he left behind a trust valued at approximately $1.8 million. When my grandmother Eloise passed 12 years later, in 2016, the trust had grown to just over $2.3 million through carefully managed bond investments. I was 26 years old at the time of my grandmother's death. I had just completed my master's degree in financial planning and had been working for 2 years at a wealth management firm downtown. I was, by any professional metric, precisely the right person to manage a trust of this kind. My grandmother had known this. She had been watching me quietly and carefully for my entire life, in a way that no one else in my family had ever bothered to. And before she died, she had left specific written instructions. The trust was to pass to me as managing trustee, not to my mother, not to my father, to me by full legal name, with a handwritten letter attached that Gerald Hargrove at Hargrove and Blythe, the firm overseeing the estate, read aloud in a room with my parents and my sister present. The letter read, in the part I have memorized, "Vivienne sees things clearly. She has always seen things clearly. Trust her with this." My mother looked at that letter and smiled the way she smiled at pleasant surprises. "Isn't that sweet?" she said. What she understood it to mean was that I would handle the paperwork and she would continue accessing the money as she always had. She was not wrong about the paperwork part. For 6 years, I handled every piece of it. The trust had 4 beneficiaries: my mother Loretta, my father Carlton, my sister Serena, and me. The terms allowed for quarterly distributions and approved expense disbursements. I managed the investment side. I grew that trust from $2.3 million to just over $3 million in 6 years. Not through luck. Through quarterly rebalancing, through reading Federal Reserve commentary on Sunday evenings, through moving 30% of the bond holdings into short-duration instruments when rates began to shift in 2022, through declining a long weekend trip with colleagues because I was in the middle of a ladder restructure and the timing wasn't right. No one in my family knew any of this was happening. To them, the money appeared because they deserved it. The way heat appears when you turn up the thermostat was no particular thought for the system generating it. I want to be honest about what those 6 years actually looked like. It was not glamorous. Trust administration is a set of repeating obligations, quarterly reports, annual reviews, correspondence with attorneys, rebalancing decisions, tax document filings, distribution authorizations. Each task individually is manageable. Collectively, maintained in parallel with a demanding full-time career, they are a substantial second workload. I did not complain about this. I had agreed to the role. I took it seriously because my grandmother had taken it seriously when she placed it in my hands. But I also never told anyone in my family what the work actually required, and they never asked. They assumed the money was managed the way they assumed dinner was cooked when they sat down to eat it, automatically, by someone invisible, in a room they were not in. My father withdrew $14,000 in approved disbursements in 2021 alone for what he described as business development expenses. I reviewed the requests, found them within the permissible terms, and approved them. He thanked me with a text message. 2 months later, Serena submitted a request for $6,000 for educational expenses, specifically a ceramic studio membership and a series of workshops. It was technically within the definition of approved educational expenditure. I approved it. She did not thank me at all. I had noted this absence of acknowledgement, not with resentment at the time, but with the neutral curiosity of a person observing data. In retrospect, I was building a very clear picture that I had simply not yet decided what to do with. Now I need to tell you about Serena. Serena is 31 years old. She is 3 years younger than me and has, in the family vocabulary, always been sensitive. That phrase, sensitive, is doing enormous amounts of work in my family. It is a word that covers a pattern of behavior that began when Serena was approximately 9 years old and discovered that expressing distress produced results in our household the way pressing a button produces light. I want to be fair to her here because fairness matters to me even when it is uncomfortable. Serena is not a cartoonishly cruel person. She is something more ordinary and in some ways harder to reckon with. She is a person who learned very early that her emotional state was the family's primary weather system, and she was never given any reason to unlearn that lesson. So she didn't. By the time we were adults, the pattern was fully formed. Serena lived 40 minutes from my parents in a house my mother and father had helped her purchase in 2019 by drawing a special disbursement from the trust. $47,000, approved as a capital housing need. I signed the disbursement paperwork myself. At the time, I believed I was helping my sister. I believed that was what families did with their resources. I filed the forms and did not resent the process. That version of me had not yet had enough data points. Here are 3 data points. In 2018, I was promoted to senior wealth manager at my firm. My company hosted a small celebratory dinner for the occasion, and I invited my parents. Serena called my mother the morning of the event to say she was having an anxiety episode. My parents did not come to the dinner. I sat at the table with my colleagues and told everyone my family had a prior commitment. My director, A sharp-eyed woman named Sandra, who noticed most things, caught my eye across the table and held it for a half-second. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In 2020, when I became engaged to my then-partner Daniel, I called my mother on a Tuesday evening to share the news. She said, "Oh, Viv, that is wonderful, hold on." And I heard the muffled sound of her covering the receiver and whispering, and then she came back on the line and said, "Let me call you back tomorrow, sweetheart. Serena just texted that she is having a hard week." She called back 4 days later. By that point, I had already told everyone I cared about and had stopped expecting my family to be among the first to know anything. And then there was Christmas 2021, the last Christmas before the one from which I was removed. All of us gathered at my parents' house in Bexley, the brick colonial on Drexel Avenue. I had driven up with gifts, wine I had been saving, and the particular kind of tired hope that keeps appearing long after it has earned a rest. Serena arrived 2 hours late and within 10 minutes of walking through the door said to my mother within my earshot, "Can you ask Vivienne not to talk about work stuff? It makes me feel bad about myself." My mother turned to me and said, "You heard her, honey. Just keep it light." I kept it light. I sat at that Christmas table for 4 hours and did not mention my career once. While my father told his commercial real estate stories and Serena received compliments on a pottery class she had recently started. On the drive home, I called Daniel from the car. I said, "I think I am going to be erased from that family by the time I am 40. He said, "You could stop showing up." I said, "I know," but I kept showing up. Because you do until you don't. The call came on December 16th. I remember because I had just closed out a quarterly review report for the trust and was sitting at my desk with my second cup of coffee when my mother's name appeared on my screen. We exchanged pleasantries. She asked about the weather in Columbus. She asked whether I was seeing anyone since Daniel and I had ended our engagement earlier that year. And then, with the smooth, prepared ease of someone who has rehearsed the words at least once, she said, "Vivienne, your father and I have been talking, and we think this Christmas, it might be best if you celebrate on your own this year. Serena has been really struggling lately, and she has expressed that having you around creates a certain energy she cannot manage right now." I sat very still. I counted the space between my inhale and my exhale. 1, 2, 3. "What kind of energy?" I asked. "You know," my mother said. "You are very intense. You have always been very intense. Very achievement-focused. It makes Serena feel inadequate. We just want her to have one Christmas where she can fully relax." "I see," I said. "You understand, don't you? You are the strong one. You can handle this." I said, "I understand completely," and I meant every syllable. I understood that I had spent 34 years being reliable enough to be taken for granted and quiet enough to be removed without drama. I understood that being called the strong one had never been a compliment. It had always been a permission slip. It was the family's way of saying, "You don't require tending, so we will not tend to you. Your needs are not a weather event we need to prepare for." I said goodbye, set the phone down, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the trust management portal and sat looking at the numbers for a long time without typing. $30,041,217. A number that existed because of 6 years of sustained, careful, unrecognized work. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the specific arithmetic of what had just happened. My mother had called to tell me that my sister's emotional comfort was worth more than my presence at a family holiday. She had done this in a phone call that lasted approximately 7 minutes. She had prefaced the decision with the information that I was too intense and achievement-focused, as though being good at things was a character flaw that needed managing. She had closed by reminding me that I was the strong one and that the strong one would understand. She had offered this as a comfort. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone and look at what is underneath. Here's what I found underneath. That being called the strong one had been functioning in my family as a mechanism of extraction for as long as I could remember. My reliability had been harvested. My competence had been harvested. My silence had been harvested, not maliciously perhaps, not with deliberate calculation, but systematically over decades, through the simple repeated reinforcement that Vivienne could handle things and therefore didn't need tending, that Vivienne would show up so you didn't have to hold a place for her, that Vivienne's presence was optional, because Vivienne had proven she didn't collapse without it. And now my mother had made that implicit policy explicit. She had called to inform me that my presence was not required this Christmas, because someone who had never once managed a quarterly trust filing found my achievements uncomfortable to be near. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat very still for a very long time. And then I made a series of decisions. That was the moment I stopped being the strong one they didn't worry about. That was the moment I started becoming the one they should have been watching all along. I want to be very precise about what I did next, because precision matters here. What followed was not impulsive. It was not a tantrum dressed in professional language. It was a quiet, legally sound, 11-week process that I executed with the same methodical care I brought to every financial decision I had ever made on behalf of a family that had just told me I was surplus to their holiday. On the morning of December 17th, I called Gerald Hargrove at Hargrove and Blythe. Gerald is in his late 60s. He knew my grandmother for decades and had delivered her handwritten letter to me at the estate reading. I had worked closely with him for 6 years on trust business, and he respected my professional judgment without qualification. I told him I wanted to review the trustee succession documents and make several structural amendments to the disbursement protocols. He asked if there was a particular reason. I said, due diligence. I want to make sure the structure reflects best practices for long-term stewardship. He said he would have everything pulled together by the following Monday. I spent Christmas Day alone in my apartment eating pad thai from the container. I ate the first portion at 6:47 in the evening. I ordered a second at 11:47 at night. I read trust documentation until past 1 in the morning. 240 pages of PDF, bookmarked and annotated by the time I turned the light off. By then, the outline of a plan was clear. The existing trust structure gave me broad unilateral authority over investment decisions and day-to-day administration. Quarterly distributions required my signature. My grandmother had designed it this way intentionally. She trusted me, but the structure also contained a vulnerability. In theory, my parents could petition to have a co-trustee appointed if they felt I was acting against beneficiary interests. I had given them no grounds to do so. But I had learned on December 16th that trust and gratitude were not the same thing, and that performance did not guarantee appreciation in this particular household. I was not going to wait for them to find grounds. I was going to build something they couldn't reach. On December 29th, I drafted the amendment. I called it internally a Unified Consent Protocol. Its terms were straightforward. Any change in trustee authority, any special disbursement above $15,000, and any modification to the distribution schedule would require written consent from at least 3 of the 4 beneficiaries. I was one beneficiary. Mathematically, this meant that my mother, father, and Serena could not collectively override me or approve a major expense without my participation, and they could not remove me as trustee without a court order demonstrating cause. There was no cause. I spent the first week of January refining the language with Gerald over 3 separate phone calls. Gerald is methodical and careful, and does not rush documents. On Thursday morning of the second week, he called me and said, "Vivienne, this is a significant tightening of the structure. I want to make sure you are certain." I said, "Gerald, I have managed this trust for 6 years without a single missed filing, a single misallocated dollar, or a single formal complaint from any beneficiary. I think the structure should reflect that record." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a sound argument." The amendment was filed with the county probate court on January 14th. Notification letters went to all beneficiaries at their addresses of record on January 16th. In the second week of January, I also scheduled an appointment with a family law and estate attorney named Patricia Dunmore, recommended by Gerald. 22 years of experience in trust law. I wanted to understand the precise perimeter of my authority and my obligations. Patricia confirmed that my fiduciary duty was to manage the trust in the long-term interests of all beneficiaries, which I was doing with documented precision, and that my grandmother's designation of me as sole managing trustee was written with clear legal intentionality and was not vulnerable to challenge without substantial cause. I paid Patricia for 3 hours of her time from my personal checking account, not from the trust. I kept her invoice in a folder I labeled simply Foundation. My family had no idea any of this was happening. The January distribution hit their accounts on the 15th as it always had. $3,000 each, deposited cleanly. My mother sent me a text that said, "Happy New Year, sweetheart, hope you're well." I replied with a heart emoji and did not call. February brought the first test. My father sent me an email about a commercial property in the Dublin suburb of Columbus, a former retail strip he believed could be repositioned as mixed-use residential and light commercial. He estimated the acquisition and renovation cost at approximately $220,000 and described it as an investment opportunity aligned with our collective financial future. He asked whether a special disbursement from the trust would be appropriate. The email was 3 paragraphs long and used the phrase "our collective future" twice. He had not asked how my Christmas had been. I wrote back 1 paragraph. I explained that special disbursements above $15,000 now required written consent from at least 3 beneficiaries, and that I would be happy to circulate a formal request form to all 4 parties for review as soon as he submitted the required supporting documentation, including a property appraisal, a due diligence report, and a projection of anticipated returns. I attached a PDF of the January amendment. I signed the email with my full name and title, Vivienne Ashworth, Managing Trustee. He called 20 minutes later. "What is this document?" he said. "A structural amendment to the trust," I said, "filed in January. It strengthens the governance framework in line with current best practices for family trust administration." "Vivienne, this says I need your permission?" "You need the consent of 3 of 4 beneficiaries," I said. "Which includes me, yes. If you have questions about the legal structure, Gerald at Hargrove and Blythe can walk you through it." There was a long pause. Long enough that I could hear him breathing. "Is this about Christmas?" "Dad," I said, "I am managing a $3 million asset. Everything I do is about fiduciary responsibility." He did not push further that evening, but I could hear in his silence the first small shift, the quiet recognition that something in the room had changed, though he could not yet name the shape of it. My mother called the next evening. Her approach was warmer and more elliptical, the way she always approached things she wanted without appearing to want them. She asked how I was doing. She mentioned Serena had started with a new therapist and that the sessions were really helping. She said she hoped I wasn't holding on to the Christmas arrangement. I told her I wasn't holding on to anything at all. I told her I was doing very well. I mentioned, once and only once, that I had received a promotion in January to managing director at my firm. "That is wonderful," she said, and in the pause that followed I could hear the faint recalibration that happens when information arrives that doesn't match the picture a person has been carrying. "Managing director," she repeated. "At 34. "Yes," I said. And then I changed the subject to something easier, and we talked for 11 more minutes, and I was warm and pleasant and gave away nothing. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a while. Not unhappily. I was beginning to understand something that my grandmother had likely understood for years, that the power I had was not in confrontation, it was in consistency. Every month I filed. Every quarter I distributed. Every year the trust grew. The architecture I was building was not made of anger. It was made of records, of dates and amounts and signatures and court filings, of a paper trail so clean and well documented that there was not a single stone for anyone to throw. Through February and into March, I executed 2 additional steps. The first was a continued and careful documentation of every trust decision I made, every rebalancing trade, every filing, every communication with Hargrove and Blythe. Not because this was new, I had always kept records, but I moved them from my professional server to a secured personal archive that was mine alone. I printed certain key documents and placed them in a locked fireproof box that I kept in the closet of my home office. I told no one about the box. The second was that in mid-February I began slowly, deliberately, reintroducing myself to the broader financial and estate planning community in Columbus in ways I had previously let slide. I joined 2 professional committees I had been invited to join years earlier and had declined due to time constraints. I accepted a speaking invitation to present at a lunch seminar for local estate attorneys on the topic of trustee best practices in family trust environments. I made sure my name and credentials were clearly visible in every room I entered. I was not doing this for vanity. I was doing it because I understood, from both professional experience and from the last 11 weeks of my personal life, that the best protection available to a person in a position of stewardship is a spotless, well-documented, publicly visible, professional reputation. I was making myself undeniable. I also, in the second week of March, had one private conversation that I have never told my family about. I called my grandmother's oldest friend, Edna, who had attended my grandmother's funeral, and pressed my hand in both of hers and said, "Your grandmother was so proud of you. She told me so every time I saw her." I called Edna and I asked if she would be willing to come to Easter brunch. I explained, in general terms, that there was something I needed to address with my family and that I would value her presence. Edna was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your grandmother told me you would know when the time was right." I believe her. I'll be there. She asked no further questions. I want you to understand the texture of those weeks, the weeks between January and Easter, because they are the most important part of this story. Even though nothing dramatic happened in them, I went to work every morning. I managed portfolios. I answered emails. I made dinner. I slept. I read. On weekends, I sometimes drove out to a small lake east of Columbus and sat in my car with the window down and listened to the water. I was not agitated. I was not anxious. I was, for the first time in years, completely at peace inside my own choices. There is a particular calm that comes when you have stopped bending yourself into the shape that other people need you to be. I had been performing low maintenance for my entire adult life in that family, and when I stopped performing it, I discovered that the maintenance I had been saving had been accumulating somewhere quiet and was now available for my own use. My mother called the third week of March to invite me to Easter brunch. "We would love to have you," she said, with the warmth of a woman who has decided to be magnanimous. "Serena has been doing better, and I think she is ready." I was, in the grammar of her sentence, a variable to be reintroduced when conditions were favorable, a controlled substance to be administered at the appropriate dosage. "I would love to come," I said. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," she said, and then, softly, "We have missed you." If you are still watching at this point, I want to pause and ask you to do something very simple. Go to the comments right now and type the word clarity, because this story is entering its most important chapter, and I want to know exactly how many of you are still here. And if this is your very first time on Revenge Chronicles, please subscribe before you scroll any further. We are here every single day, telling these stories, because we believe every woman who has been called the strong one deserves to have her story told out loud. I wore a cream-colored wool blazer to Easter brunch. I arrived at my parents' house in Bexley at 11:15 in the morning, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a small arrangement of potted tulips in pale yellow and white. The house was full. My parents had invited both sets of their closest friends, my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, and her husband and their 3 adult children, my father's college friend Raymond and his wife Diane, several neighbors, and my grandmother's oldest friend Edna, who was 81 years old and had driven 40 minutes from her home in Worthington because I had called her 2 days prior and asked her to come. She had said yes without asking why. Serena was stationed in the kitchen when I arrived, helping my mother arrange a fruit platter and her floral Easter dress. She looked at me when I walked in. She did not hug me. She smiled the careful smile of someone performing goodwill for a watching audience. Brunch was set for noon. Gerald Hargrove arrived at 11:45. I had not told my parents Gerald was coming. I had told Gerald that a meeting of all 4 beneficiaries would be necessary to address some trust governance matters, and that Easter brunch at the family home provided the first opportunity to gather everyone naturally. I mentioned that my grandmother's old friend Edna, who had been a witness to the original trust documents at their execution in 2004, would also be present. Gerald had called it sound timing. He arrived in his weekend clothes, a gray sport coat over a blue shirt, his leather portfolio under his arm, looking entirely like what he was, a distinguished attorney on an ordinary errand. My father saw him cross the threshold and went still. He was standing near the kitchen island with a glass of orange juice and a relaxed smile. The smile stayed on his face, but everything behind it changed. "Carlton," Gerald said, extending his hand. "Happy Easter." "Gerald," my father said, "this is a surprise. Vivienne asked me to come by. A bit of trust business." My mother appeared from the kitchen. Her eyes moved from Gerald to me and back to Gerald. "What is going on?" "Nothing alarming," I said in the tone I use with clients when I need the room's temperature to remain level. "Gerald and I need a few minutes with everyone before we sit down. Family business. It will not take long." We gathered in the living room. My parents on the sofa. Serena in the armchair she always claimed in that room. Me standing near the window where the light was good. Gerald with his portfolio open on the coffee table. Edna in the wingback chair beside the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, watching me the way my grandmother used to watch me, with patient, complete attention. Gerald explained the amendment in the measured cadence of a man who has delivered complex legal information for 40 years and has learned that clarity is a form of mercy. He explained the Unified Consent Protocol. He explained that any special disbursement above $15,000 now required written consent from 3 of the 4 beneficiaries. He explained that the trustee structure had been legally reinforced and that removing me would require a formal court proceeding demonstrating cause. He explained all of this without drama and without any particular expression on his face. My mother went through several expressions in the time it took Gerald to finish. Confusion first, then understanding, then the particular stillness of a person who has just realized that the foundation they were standing on has been quietly redesigned. "Vivienne," my father said very slowly. "When did this happen?" "January 14th, I said. "Filed with the probate court. You received a courtesy notification at the address on file." My mother said, "I never saw." "It was mailed on January 16th, Gerald said quietly, checking his notes. "To the Drexel Avenue address." Serena said nothing. She was looking at me in a way she had never looked at me before in our lives. Not with contempt or performance or careful calculation. With something much simpler and harder to maintain, genuine attention. "I want to be clear about something," I said. I did not raise my voice. The room was already completely silent. 23 people in the house, and the only sound was the faint noise of a conversation continuing in the kitchen, where someone had not yet been told to come in. I have managed this trust for 6 years. I grew it from $2.3 million to $3,041,000. I have not missed a filing. I have not misallocated a dollar. I have not once been asked whether the work was sustainable, whether I needed anything, or whether I was all right. What I have been, consistently, is available. I paused. Until December 16th of last year, I was available. On that day, I was told that my presence at Christmas was incompatible with my sister's comfort, that I was too intense, too achievement-focused, that I should celebrate alone because I was the strong one and the strong one could handle it. The kitchen conversation had gone quiet. Someone had told them to come in. "I am not here to punish anyone," I said. "The quarterly distributions continue on schedule. The trust is healthy and will remain healthy as long as I am managing it, which I intend to continue doing with the same standard I have always maintained, but the structure now reflects the reality of what this asset is, a legal entity that belongs to all 4 of us equally. not a resource to be accessed at the convenience of whoever is in favor in a given season. I looked at my father. Dad, regarding the Dublin property, when you submit a formal disbursement request with the required documentation, I will circulate it to all beneficiaries for review. That review process takes a minimum of 30 days. My father set his orange juice down on the side table. The glass made a small, precise sound in a very quiet room. Raymond looked at his wife. Aunt Patricia looked at my mother. Two of the neighbors looked at each other. Edna, in the wingback chair, gave me the very smallest nod. The same nod my grandmother used to give me across dinner tables when I had said something true in a room that was pretending truth wasn't available. My mother said, "Vivienne, can we speak about this privately?" "We will," I said. "After brunch." "Gerald, thank you for your time." Gerald closed his portfolio. We walked into the dining room. 23 people sat down to Easter lunch with the full understanding that something significant had just occurred, even if most of them could not have named precisely what. I ate well that afternoon. I spoke with Edna about her garden, which she tended herself still, a fact she was proud of. I asked Raymond's wife Diane about her daughter's graduate school applications. I was warm and present and entirely myself in a way I had not been permitted to be at the last Christmas I attended, when I had been asked to suppress the parts of me that made my sister feel less. I was not cold. I was not triumphant. I was simply, completely, undiluted. In the weeks after Easter, my mother called 3 times. The calls grew progressively more honest as they went. The first call, 2 days after brunch, was operational. She wanted to understand whether the amendment could be reversed. I explained that it was legally filed and would remain in place as long as I served as managing trustee. She asked if there was any situation in which I might agree to remove it. I said, "Mom, the amendment is a governance improvement, not a retaliation mechanism. The trust is better structured now than it was before. That serves everyone." She was quiet for a long time after that. The second call came the following Saturday afternoon. My mother said she was sorry. She said it plainly, in the way that she rarely said difficult things, without the usual padding of tangential warmth. She said she had not understood how much the Christmas decision had hurt me, and that she had been thinking about it a great deal. I said, "Mom, it wasn't only Christmas." She waited. "It was every time you called me the strong one as a justification for needing me less. Every time Serena's discomfort was weighted more heavily than my presence. For years. It wasn't one decision. It was an accumulation." She didn't have an answer ready for that. I hadn't expected her to. I wasn't looking for a verdict. I was naming a thing that had been present in the room for 30 years and had never been spoken directly. There is a particular relief in that, even when nothing is resolved. The naming itself is a form of arrival. The third call came 2 weeks into April. When I answered, I heard 2 voices, which told me something had been planned. My mother spoke first to establish the call and then said Serena wanted to say something. Serena's voice was quieter than I was used to, less arranged. She said, "I know I have been the reason you have been excluded from things. I am not going to pretend I didn't understand what was happening. I did understand. And I let it happen." She paused for several seconds. "I do not have an explanation that makes that okay." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for saying that, Serena. That genuinely matters to me." Because it did. Not because it resolved anything with perfect neatness, but because honesty offered freely by someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding it is a real and difficult thing. And I have always believed in acknowledging real things when they appear. The trust remains structured exactly as I rebuilt it. My father's Dublin property request was formally submitted in late April with the required documentation and circulated to all 4 beneficiaries for review. Serena voted in favor. I reviewed the materials carefully and voted no on the grounds that the projected return calculations were based on occupancy assumptions that were not supported by the comparable properties data in the market report. My mother, who told me honestly that she did not understand the financial documents well enough to vote responsibly, abstained. Without 3 affirmative votes, the disbursement was not approved. My father did not speak to me for 11 days. On the 12th day he called me. He said in the careful voice of a man learning a new posture, "Would you be willing to look at the numbers with me?" I said yes. I drove to Bexley on a Sunday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table where I had been asked, years ago, to make myself smaller so the room would be more comfortable. I opened my laptop, I looked at my father's projections, and I spent 3 hours going through the property analysis with him. The Dublin opportunity was not as strong as he had believed, but there was a smaller adjacent transaction, a single-unit commercial space, that had better fundamentals. We are still working through the due diligence together. It is the first time in my adult life that my father has asked for my professional opinion and meant it. Not as a transaction, not as a convenience, but as a genuine request. He took notes. He asked follow-up questions. He said, "At one point, you really know this stuff?" And I said, "I know. I've known it for a long time." He looked at me for a moment and then he looked back at his notepad and wrote something down, and I let that be enough. My relationship with Serena is the most complex of the 3. She and I have spoken 4 times since Easter, which is approximately 4 more times than we have spoken willingly in the previous 3 years. The conversations are careful. Neither of us is performing. She is working, she tells me, on understanding the mechanics of her own behavior in therapy. The way she learned to use distress as a tool, and why she never examined that habit until now. I do not rush her. I do not offer reassurance she has not earned. But I also do not withhold the possibility of something different. I am, it turns out, not particularly interested in permanent estrangement from my sister. What I was interested in, and have now achieved, is honesty. The kind that doesn't require me to make myself small in order to remain in the room. Some weeks after that Sunday at the kitchen table, sitting alone in my Columbus apartment with a cup of tea cooling beside me and the city quiet outside my window, I thought about my grandmother. I thought about that letter. I have thought about it many times, but that evening I thought about it differently. I thought about what it meant that she had written it at all, when she could simply have named me in the documents without explanation. She had written the letter because she had wanted me to know that she saw me, that she had always seen me, that the designation was not accidental or administrative but intentional, considered and loving. She had not chosen me to manage the trust because I was the most convenient option. She had chosen me because across the full span of my life, she had watched me pay attention in rooms where no one else was paying attention, do the work in situations where no one else was tracking the work, and hold steady in moments where the louder people around me were choosing noise. She had seen what my parents had been too preoccupied to notice, that quiet does not mean unaware, that stillness does not mean passive, that the person who does not perform their competence is still competent. I think about what the alternative looked like. What would have happened if on December 16th I had broken? If I had cried on the phone or sent a long, wounded message cataloging every year of accumulated grievance? I know exactly what would have happened. I would have been managed. I would have been spoken to in soft, concerned tones and told that I was misinterpreting, that I was overreacting, that no one was trying to hurt me, that I needed to understand Serena's situation better, and that the strong one ought to be able to take these things in stride. And in the reframing of my reaction as the problem, the original injury would have dissolved. Nothing would have changed. Not a single thing. Instead, I sat still. I read documents. I made phone calls in my professional voice. I filed paperwork. I built something they could not reach. And 8 weeks later, 23 people watched my family learn something that had been true for 6 years, that the person they had been taking for granted was the person holding the foundation. I want to say something very directly to anyone watching this who has been placed in the same position I was placed in. Not just the trust management, but the larger architecture of it, the being called reliable and then not being called, the being labeled strong and then being asked to carry that strength through your own exclusion without complaint, the being the one who does the quiet work while someone else's louder distress becomes the family's primary concern. I want to say, You are not obligated to continue performing low maintenance for people who have mistaken your composure for indifference to your own needs. You are allowed to care about yourself as much as you care about the systems you maintain. You are allowed to restructure the terms. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. I have been living inside that truth for 16 months now, and I have never been quieter, and I have never been more certain of where I stand. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Have you ever been called the strong one in your family? Not as a compliment, but as a reason for someone to need you less? Have you ever sat at a table and been asked to dim yourself so someone else could shine more easily? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that without qualification. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story right now, if you have not yet gotten to your Easter Sunday, if you are still in the December of it, still sitting quietly with information that the people around you do not yet understand, they should be paying attention to, I want you to know that the December is not the failure. The December is the preparation. Everything you are building in the silence of this period is real, even when it is invisible, especially when it is invisible. The most durable things are built before anyone arrives to watch. Do not announce your moves. Do not seek their acknowledgement of what you are doing. Do not look for the moment when they notice and feel the appropriate amount of regret. Just build. File the documents, take the meetings, make the phone calls in your professional voice, grow the number, and let the architecture speak for itself when the time comes, in a room, in front of the people who need to understand what quiet looks like when it has been paying attention for 6 years. My grandmother saw this in me from an armchair. Someone in your life has seen it in you too. Build toward them. I want to take a moment, before this story closes, to say something directly to each of you who find your way to this channel. You did not stumble here by accident. The stories that find us are usually the stories we needed to hear. And I believe that with everything I have, every comment you leave, every share, every quiet moment where you pressed play because something in the thumbnail said this one will understand, that is the reason Revenge Chronicles exists. We built this space because we believe that women who have been overlooked in their own families, their own rooms, their own chapters, deserve to have their stories spoken out loud, with care and with craft and without apology. You are not invisible here, you are seen here. If today's story reached something in you, please share it with one person who needs it. Subscribe so you are here when the next one comes. And know, without question, that every single time you press play, you are telling us that the quiet ones deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here. That is not a small thing. It never has been,